Okay, well, I see people are filing in. We'll get started with the webinar. So again, welcome to everyone from the Bernard L. Schwartz Rediscovering Government Initiative and today's webinar, a new measure to end poverty. We're very glad to be joined in this research and program by the Center for Economic and Policy Research, CEPR. I'll give you a quick overview of what we'll be doing today. We'll be, and there are full bios for all of today's presenters on the event page. So to save time, we won't give everyone's full bio. We'll first hear from Eileen Applebaum, the co-director of CEPR. Then we will, Jeff Madrick, the director of the Rediscovering Government Initiative at the Century Foundation, will introduce Sean Framstad, the author of the new paper released this week, proposing new measures to end poverty. And then we are joined by a wonderful panel of experts, three of whom have been friends of mine for a very long time. Arlek Sherman, a vice president at the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington, D.C. Sandra Collette, a welfare activist and social justice organizer in New York City. And Sean Framstad, of course, our author. And then very excited to make a new friend, Ann Price, from the Insight Center in California. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Jeff Madrick, turn over to Eileen Applebaum first, to also give a little bit of a welcome and her perspective on why this is such an important topic for CEPR to engage in.
Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to this very important conversation. I think it's obvious why this is a really important time to be talking about how we measure poverty, what we think is appropriate, because of course COVID-19 has made it clear to everyone just how inadequate our measures of poverty are, and just how much people who are at the poverty line, certainly those below, but those even at or slightly above, just how inadequate the resources they have to deal with all of the challenges that COVID-19 has presented. So Sean is going to talk today about the weaknesses in the measures of poverty, the official poverty measurement and the supplementary poverty measurement, how weak they are. He provides a lot of really detailed and fact-driven information about what it is that families need. And he's looking to keep it simple at a family unit with 2 adults and 2 children. And even if we were to accept as reasonable, which we don't, the specific categories in the supplementary poverty measure for food, clothing, shelter, and utilities, Sean shows that the amount of money left to a family after that is just inadequate for meeting today's necessary standard of living. Transportation, which is the second largest household expenditure after shelter, is lumped in with work expenses and provides a fixed amount for travel to work. So there's nothing there if you need to take your kids to the doctor, if you need to go to the supermarket, if you need to show up at a school event or at a meeting with an employer. There's just nothing there to allow you to be able to travel to those kinds of meetings. And in addition, I mean, really important, I think, to this group and in general is the way that the supplementary poverty measure treats expenditures for healthcare and childcare. There's no allowance for healthcare or for childcare. Instead, what the SPM does, it subtracts from a person's income their out-of-pocket costs for healthcare and childcare. So if you can't afford healthcare or childcare, you get no allowance for it whatsoever. So really, these measures are very inadequate. And then Sean provides a rationale for a rather complete list of goods and services that families really need not to be poor. I'll just mention a couple of them. Everybody understands why you need a home computer or internet access today. How are kids going to do their schoolwork? How are people going to be able to carry on with their lives? There's no allowance for keeping your house clean. There's no housekeeping supplies in it. How about the things that kids need just to be able to develop normally and to have opportunities for things like tricycles, bicycles, sports, and cultural events. There has to be, and activities, there has to be money for that if kids are going to be able to grow up into healthy, functioning adults. Payments on student loans, the goods and services that people with disabilities need in order to have access, have equal access to things. And what about retirement savings? So Sean really develops very fully what you need in order not to be poor. And it's very clear that the $385 that the supplementary poverty measure allocates for all of these expenditures is just totally inadequate. But I think the most important, to me at least, the most important thing about this paper is that it challenges the idea of what we think is good enough for poor people. He challenges that whole idea. And he's all about asking what is the minimum income that it takes to keep a family from being poor? I think that is really the question. And so he's fundamentally shifting us away from a focus on what's barely adequate and those people, that's all they need, or that's all they deserve, to what is a minimum adequate floor under all families, and that will protect everybody, not just the poor, but people are falling out of the middle class right now. Between the pandemic and the shutdown of the economy, people are falling out of the middle class, and they need a floor under them so they know that there's at least some minimum standard of adequacy that they can provide for themselves and especially for their children. And while I think this is quite a revolutionary idea, the other impressive thing is that Sean has a number of pragmatic policy proposals that get us there, get us to a more revolutionary approach to dealing with poverty without requiring us to do anything that is beyond what pragmatically can be accomplished. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeff and to Sean for what I think is a very interesting conversation.
Eileen, thanks very much. I'm Jeff Madrick, director of the RGI. Eileen is one of the leading poverty and labor analysts in America, for sure in DC. So I've been grateful for her work for, I won't say because it'll give away my age. More than a few great thinkers have said, a nation will ultimately be judged by the way it deals with its poor. I don't think the US is doing very well in that matter. And that's an important failing. One critical reason, reason I know that, is the deliberate mismeasurement of the number of poor, and that's what we're addressing today. Poverty, in truth, is an abstract concept. Some believe we shouldn't even use the word. They prefer low income. Measuring it with accuracy, however, is the foundation of decent poverty policy. And that's why we're doing this today. One quick bit of history that some people may not be aware of. As far back as the LBJ administration, government sought to use low poverty measures. Back then, they chose the lower of Molly Orshansky's two poverty measures. Orshansky was the innovative Social Security analyst who came up with a poverty measure. Ultimately, the lower of the two she proposed ultimately became the official measure in 1969. She wasn't a little bit she was a little bit upset by that, I should say. We also long ago rejected the idea of a relative poverty measure that would take into account what analysts call social inclusion, that all citizens should be able to participate in the economy, or otherwise we should think of them as deprived. As Eileen suggested, we are very lucky to have Sean Framstad's excellent, detailed, comprehensive paper, which puts together the pieces on the official poverty measurement, the new, relatively new and not so new, supplemental poverty measure, and he discusses the appropriateness of a relative poverty measure, a measure as a percent of family income or something similar. That, most believe, is a social inclusion measure. So Sean, thanks very much. He's going to present his paper now. Sean is currently a senior fellow, I may have the title wrong, at the Center for Economic and Policy Research. He has had high positions at CAP and the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities. He's simply one of the leading statistical analysts in DC on these kinds of issues and what issues are more important. So Sean, let me throw it to you.
Thank you so much. Those introductions were too kind. I hope my presentation lives up to them. And it's really great to have had the opportunity to do this work with Jeff, with the Bernard Schwartz Center and the Century Foundation. And great to see such a terrific panel to discuss these issues also. Both Ann Price and Arlek Sherman have really sharpened my thinking on these issues in the past. So, and I know they'll continue to do so in the remarks. And Sandra, I don't know you, but I'm definitely looking forward to your comments too. So I'll start by saying there's really two ways poverty measures are used. This is kind of the why do they matter. First of all, they're used as economic and social indicators. I talk about the statistical purposes of poverty measurement in the paper. And the basic idea here is we just need to make visible whether America is growing together or apart. And the second way they're typically used is for rationing social benefits and services. This is done via means testing in public programs, via the distribution of federal funds among areas. One just kind of thing I want to foreground is I think it's that economic and social indicator function that's important to emphasize and important to make sure we have a measure that lives up to. If anything, I think we should use poverty measures, poverty lines less in the rationing part, because we should do less means testing in a lot of programs, especially less very limited means testing. So I think make sure the first thing that it provides an accurate measure of what's happening out there in America. So next slide. Let's see. Yes, there it is. So we're going to be talking about three measures in this, at least I talk about three measures in the report. We'll be talking about three measures today. I'll just review them quickly. The first is the OPM, the official poverty measure. This is the one that has been in place since the early 1960s without any real changes. The second is the supplemental poverty measure. This was developed based on recommendations in the 1990s and adopted in a more formal way in the Obama administration. The third is not a measurement used by the federal government, but it is a very common conventional measure used by most wealthy Western countries, used by international organizations like the OECD. I call this the CPM, or conventional poverty measure. It's sometimes also called a relative measure, but that can get confusing because the supplemental poverty measure is relative in parts, and so I'm just going to call it the conventional poverty measure for today. So the first big kind of area that we can compare these measures on is looking at where they set the poverty line. So the poverty line is the amount of income you have to have, the amount of income, and if you have under that, you're poor. If you have over that, you're not poor. So the OPM, Jeff mentioned, very outdated, really. It is, if anything, a 1950s, 1960s measure of poverty. It has only been adjusted since the 1960s for inflation. So it's more like if you could travel back into time and live in the 1960s on a particular amount of income, the official poverty measure is the one you want to look at. The supplemental poverty measure sets the poverty line equal to the 33rd percentile of consumption expenditures on food, shelter, utilities, and clothes, multiplied by 1.2. It varies by housing tenure. It also varies by geographic differences in housing costs. The conventional poverty measure is typically set at 50 or 60% of median disposable income. So it's tied to mainstream income rather than a percentile of consumption. Typically, it is adjusted or used in two different ways. Governments may adjust it every year to keep up with changes for median income, or they may anchor it to a specific year and then adjust it only by inflation. And you see countries like the United Kingdom tracking it both ways. The second big element of poverty measures is what income counts or what resource counts. The OPM is very limited to money income. The supplemental poverty measure, the SPM, includes money income certain forms of in-kind income like SNAP, housing assistance, and importantly, it includes tax credits like the earned income tax credit and the child tax credit. The conventional poverty measure is typically the same. Another issue is what gets subtracted. So before you compare income to the poverty line, what do you subtract? In the OPM, nothing's subtracted. Even taxes owed, tax obligations aren't subtracted. The SPM subtracts taxes. It subtracts spending on childcare for work, healthcare. To some extent, it subtracts commuting and work expenses, although it uses a flat rate, so it's the same allowance for everybody. The CPM, typically, it only subtracts tax obligations. And then just noting kind of across these measures, one of the kinds of resources that aren't counted is wealth. And one of the kinds of things that obligations or expenses that are not typically subtracted are debt. So things like student loan debt, criminal justice debt, other sorts of mandatory debt. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this really kind of, so that was kind of talking about it in a conceptual way. This shows the actual dollar amounts. These are poverty lines for a 2-adult, 2-child family in 2018. The SPM, I show 2 SPM poverty lines here, the one for homeowners without mortgages and the one for renters. There's also a third for homeowners with a mortgage, although that's really not that different from renters, so I don't show that. So of these 4 measures, the SPM for homeowners with no mortgage is the lowest at about $24,000. The OPM is a little bit higher, $25,000, $465. The SPM for renters is about $2,500 more than the $28,000. And then the conventional poverty measure is about $20,000 more than the SPM, so nearly $40,000 in 2018. So that's where you see the real substantial difference. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So the basic argument of the report is that the OPM over the last half century now, or more than half century that's been in place, has defined poverty down over time. And the SPM has, although better in many respects than the OPM, has locked a lot of that defining down of poverty in place. So we really don't have a more modern contemporary line. And I make this case by comparing the OPM and the SPM to trends in mainstream living standards, to the public's prevailing views of what it takes to not be poor or the minimum income that's needed to get by, and to budget standards developed by experts. Although I use a caveat, there's an important caveat here. There are budget standards developed by experts that are totally abstract and unrealistic, and there are ones that are reasonable in real life. You really have to use the ones that are reasonable and real life. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So here you see a bit about how this defining down has happened even just over the last 15 years. So again, these are poverty lines for 2-adult, 2-child families, tracking them from 2005 to 2018. The basic story here is you have the conventional poverty measure, the one tied to 50% of median income on top. And as you can see, that one is not only higher than all the other measures, the gap has widened over time. I think an interesting thing to know, just to kind of put this in long-term historical perspective, when the OPM was first adopted, it was equal to roughly 50% of median income. So in the 1960s, they thought 50% of median income, that makes sense. But because then it was only adjusted for inflation and not for changes in median income, for economic growth, for those sorts of things, it has fallen farther and farther behind that standard. The other thing I would note here, I added one additional measure in here. That's the red line in kind of the middle between the blue and the yellow. That is actually the original SPM based on the original recommendations of the NAS panel and before some of the changes made by the Obama administration. And the interesting thing here is that the SPM was changed during the Obama administration in ways that had the effect of pulling the threshold further down. And this was done in a way that was transparent, but it wasn't really done with, in a way that provided any particular rationale for doing this. which I think is problematic because, you know, when making changes like that, we should be transparent about why they're being made. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Another one of the comparisons I talked about using was the public's view of what is needed not to be poor, what's needed to get by at a minimum level. This is a table from the report mixing survey information with poverty thresholds. It's complicated, so I'll just have you focus on a few of the ones with numbers in red boxes. So that first column there after the years is surveys data showing where the public thinks the federal government actually sets the poverty line. And interesting, one of these surveys was done by the American Enterprise Survey Institute. Another one was done by the Center of American Prospects. So kind of both ideological, kind of right and left ideological perspectives. But they come out the same, not surprisingly, since they're just straightforward surveys. The thing to note about that is the public basically thinks that the poverty line set by the government is much higher than what the poverty line actually is. So there's even this basic disjunction between public views and the actual thresholds. And then I think the other one I'd note here, we don't have a lot of information on where the public actually thinks the poverty line should be set, but there is this survey dating that was done back in 1989 that found it pretty much lines up with where it would be set using a conventional poverty measure, setting it at 50% of median income. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. Next slide. Oops, then go back one. Okay, so the third way of comparing this I mentioned was using expert budget standards. And I do this with both food, with housing, with some other things, but the one I'll just focus on here as an example is food. So the supplemental poverty measure has kind of what I call an implicit food standard, a food share. And for a family of two with 2 children, both over age 5, that's $700 a month. There's different standards you can compare this to. One you can compare it to is what's called the Thrifty Food Plan. This is a USDA food plan. It's used to set food stamp benefits. It assumes that you don't eat any food away from home, that you prepare basically most of your meals from scratch. It actually uses a computer optimization program to kind of fit this dollar amount to, you know, how you buy food to get all the calories you need. And that compared to that, the SPM food number is actually pretty okay. It's $700 compared to $642 for the 50 food plan. But of course, the problem is the 50 food plan is just completely unrealistic and not a real world threshold. So in the paper, I adjusted in different ways to take into account, say, the reality that people with children, people with jobs, just people in 2020 need to eat food away from home and can't prepare everything from scratch at home. And if you do that, you get something more like $800. Another way to compare it is to something called the low-cost food plan. This is also produced by USDA. It's actually the plan that I think a lot of anti-hunger advocates believe should be used in the food stamp program. And that one is about $150 more than the SPM food share. So either way, you don't get a great, you have the SPM food share falling behind more reasonable standards. And you can see this in housing too. I'm not going to talk about it here, but and then there's simply a whole nother list of things that just aren't counted at all in the SPM. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So let me just talk about the recommendations. There's kind of 5 overall recommendations. The first one is to immediately discontinue the use of the OPM as a statistical measure of poverty. Earlier this year, the Census Bureau reported that poverty, the lowest ever poverty rate on record, happened last year. And I think that's really very problematic that we have that kind of information going out. Even though it was a good year, it's simply not the case that we can credibly claim that it was the lowest ever poverty rate on record, because the measure is so poor and hasn't been updated in ways for kind of the modern reality of poverty. So we should immediately discontinue the use of the SPM, and we should do it even if there aren't any agreement on what the alternative measures for statistical poverty measurement should be. Let's go to recommendation 2, the next slide. Recommendation 2 is to adopt a conventional poverty measure, one tied to 50 or 60% of median income, as a core indicator of income poverty. And there's a lot of reasons to do this. I think most importantly, it's just a better measure of whether we are growing together or growing apart. The one thing I would say about this, though, is that we shouldn't have this be the sole measure of poverty, and we need more than one. And I think, in fact, it's this idea that we can only have one poverty measure that has probably limited our progress on getting to a better place on poverty measurement. Okay, let's go to recommendation 3. The third recommendation is then to improve and modernize the SPM threshold. There's various ways to do that, which I talk about in the report. I think the thing I want to emphasize here is that this shouldn't be thought of as a narrowly technocratic or scientific or kind of insider exercise. This is something that requires political judgment. It should involve opportunities for public input, and decision makers should provide public rationales for the decisions they make in the final measure. Okay, let's go to the next recommendation. Recommendation 4, I know we're going to be talking about this on the panel, but the SPM should be health inclusive. So it should include the cost of health insurance in the threshold. It should count employer provided and public healthcare benefits as income, although that should be capped at the amount included in the threshold. We really, this is something we didn't know how to do, but there's now been good papers, and I think we know how to do it in a way that's that works. Recommendations, these are actually 2 recommendations or 2 sub-recommendations, but they both relate to kids. And I think the bottom line here is the SPM and a CPM should take child care and children's developmental needs and participation needs seriously. And I think it's really surprising. This is really the most underdeveloped and researched component of poverty measurement, at least in the US, even though we all agree, or most people would agree, on the importance. I think this should be something that really gets much more emphasis going forward. It will take a lot of sort of researchers and experts to come together about how to do this, but we should make it a priority. And then I believe the final slide you can shift to. This is a little more technical issue, but I think it's important. Lump sum refundable tax credits play a really outsized role in the United States in terms of the welfare state. So these are things you receive once a year. They can be $2,000, $5,000, $6,000. The problem we have right now is that these tax credits are treated as being received in the tax year they're earned, rather than the payment year they're actually received. And I think there's related issues about some of the assumptions. 100% take-up is assumed. It's assumed there are no filing costs. I think all of these things reduce the accuracy and the relevance of the SPM. And I think especially because we need to get a better sense of what's happening in terms of income volatility and changes of income over time, we need something that is much more much more reflective of how these tax credits are really provided in the real world. So with that, I'm going to close and look forward to the conversation.
Sean, it's Jeff again. Thanks so much for the clear presentation and for doing it fairly quickly. I want to get to our panelists, who are terrific. They come from different backgrounds, which is why we chose them. They will surely have points of view about your presentation. I'm going to go in the order I've been given, so it's no slight on anybody. Let me start with Arlok. Hi, Arlok, how are you?
Hi, everyone. Very well. How is the sound level? How are people hearing?
I think we hear you well.
Fabulous.
Right. Just a second, Arlok, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
To get this launched, okay? And we want to give you an opportunity to react, of course, to. By the way, Arlok's one of the leading poverty experts in DC. He's with the CVPP, as we said. One question I do want to ask specifically is, do you agree that the OPM should be immediately discontinued? But go on with your comments, other comments about Sean's presentation. I know there's a lot you want to talk about.
Yeah, so um, no, but let me start with things I agree with in this paper very much, because Sean makes a number of important points. The official poverty line is out of date. It is too little to live on. And we need a poverty line that reflects modern medical and other needs, childcare and so forth. And I think we would agree that the supplemental poverty line is also too low. It's below, and it's unfortunate that there are places in the country where it's even below the official poverty line, sometimes in ways that may not make sense. But Jeff, to your question, for mundane practical reasons, I would not tell the Census Bureau to stop producing official poverty tables, because for now they are tied to eligibility rules that we all want to increase in most programs that use them. But as an advocate, it is just very helpful right now to be able to tell a member of Congress, for example, that there are 10,000 uninsured people below 130% of the official poverty line who would benefit from Medicaid expansion, or what the ratio of Head Start children to Head Start 3 and 4-year-olds is below the poverty line. Things we can't do if Census stops making detailed poverty tables down to the local level. Go ahead.
This, do you think we should develop a relative poverty measure?
Absolutely. So yes, I think we should add a relative poverty measure like other countries use. I would love to see that. I would not make it our lead measure. I think one example of a kind of time when it may not always work is if the median income is falling for a number of years, and often median income doesn't keep up, or falling relative to the inflation measure if it doesn't keep up with consumer prices. And that happens almost half the time. It would happen almost half the time, even if we, as Sean suggested, had a 5-year moving average, I believe. So and the UK, I think, found that when they adopted an anti-poverty goal, it wasn't helpful so much to have a relative poverty measure to judge themselves against. They very much succeeded in cutting child poverty in half, as they set out to do within a decade, by investing a very large sum of money, very wisely, I would say. But by the relative poverty measure that more people were watching in Britain, they didn't get much credit because they fell far short. It's just a harder standard to budge. And the next prime minister was able to cut benefits without much public protest. I would also add a friendly amendment, therefore, to the relative measure. I would say either the higher of a certain percentage of median household income, or an inflation adjustment from the highest point of the historical relative measure series. I would make the measure the higher of those two, so that people are never dinged in years when the median income is falling or not keeping up with inflation.
Let me move on, Arlek, unless you have one last quick
That's
comment.
it.
Okay, I'm going to try to come back to you. I do want to talk about healthcare, but let me move to Ann Price, who's written on measuring poverty. And I do want to, in general, Ann, are you there?
I'm here.
Nice to see you. Thank you for joining us. Thank everybody for joining. And I usually forget this, so let me say this right now. I wanted to thank all the behind the scenes people at the Century Foundation for, as usual, doing their excellent job of putting this together. And I can ask you what you think of the OPM. I think I know what you think of the OPM. But also include in that answer whether you think we should include healthcare as part of a poverty measure. It is not now included. Sean talks about that. I think everybody will have a point of view on that, but try to direct that as well as your general views of Sean's report.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you, Sean. Thank you, the Century Foundation, for this important conversation. I mean, certainly, it's clear that we have to do away with the official poverty measure. I think when people even begin to understand that this is predicated on an analysis that took place well over, about 54 years ago, and also on consumption that's somewhat upwards of 65 years old, it certainly, on the face of it, doesn't make sense to most people. I think I appreciate Sean's work and how he has pushed on really helping us think about poverty measures. There's some technical aspects that I think are really important for some of us who are really not really deeply steeped in this work, but certainly our work is predicated on looking at poverty overall. And I think that this raises a number of important questions. And I will say that from more of a standpoint of an advocate. Certainly, and I saw a couple of questions in the chat, we at the Insight Center have been, advancing an alternative poverty measure since the mid-90s. And so we certainly have a view about why we think it's inadequate. And so I just want to point out a piece of data that Sean illustrated in his chart, looking at the official poverty measure for 2018 for a family of four, which is about $2,100 a month. When we look at that in the place that I'm in out here in California, that is about $8,100 a month to really think about a basic standard of living. And I know I'm in a very high cost area, probably the highest cost in the nation. But really, when we look at two aspects of that, healthcare and childcare, that really consumes about $2,800 in terms of an expense, which is higher than the OPM for each month itself. So healthcare and childcare are higher than the overall poverty measure. And so it's so essential that we include healthcare and actually childcare. There's such an important element of someone's lived experience that there are particular drivers when we think about this, particularly in the community economic development field.
And the healthcare issue is so important, but most advocates of putting a healthcare measure in also say you have to put an income measure for healthcare in. You have to approximate what the value of Medicaid is for most people. Have you written about that? Probably you have, and I haven't noticed. Go ahead.
I haven't written about it explicitly, but it's certainly something that is in discussion. I think that how health costs are calculated, even when we think about our own measure, is less than perfect. But I think for some of this, what it really symbolizes to people, why it's so important and why we do this, is to show how out of balance this is with not just the lived experience, but also with income inequality. So healthcare costs, we know that we can actually calculate this. This is something that can be fixed, technically, but this is we know that this measure is more than just technical fixes. This is something much greater than that.
Very quickly, would you dump the OPM immediately, as Sean suggests?
I think I think Alex brought up a good point. I think, and certainly thinking about that is he's talking to congressional leaders. I think on a programmatic side, kind of on an advocate side, it does signal something very important. And it signals that we have to move towards a greater measure. So in some aspects, I really like the proposal. I think it's a little bold, but right now, our nation's understanding of this difference between this measure and what people really have to live on is just out of balance. It's off kilter. And this could help us really foster some new conversations.
Thanks a lot, Ann. Again, appreciate your being here. Sandra, I know you're here. I don't have all my windows up. Can you hear me? Sandra? Anybody see Sandra?
Sandra, you're on mute.
Actually,
Yeah, we got you.
let me go to my,
No, we've got you, Sandra. We hear
Okay.
you. And we see you.
so I am,
Look great.
I'm
Let me,
on two technical things here. Trying to make sure I can be heard. Let me know if I need to turn off anything. Can you still hear me?
yes, we can hear you. And thanks for participating. Sandra did live as a mother of two on a low income in Harlem for a while and had some experience. It was nearly as low as the poverty rate. So I do want to start, you probably have some points of view about Sean's presentation, but let me ask you whether people can live on an OPM poverty measure.
Absolutely not. I think that's the issue, right? We don't even realize that people are not living. And that goes to the narrative of who decides what someone living in poverty actually looks like, what they go through on a day-to-day basis, and still are not living. I think one of the things I said in my bio was that I raised my children alone. And I have to retract that because actually I didn't raise them alone. It took a lot of creative, inventive measures in order to raise them. That means finding appropriate public schools, free activities, fighting to try to increase public assistance, not knowing because that poverty threshold was where it was, nothing was going to happen, right? So you continue to do this. And for those political leaders, you seem to think that people are faring well, but they're actually not. And so, Jeff, I could go on, and I'm going to let you just give me the questions, and I'll try best to answer them.
Yeah.
But I would say right now that we can do two things at once. COVID-19 has proven that there are things that we can do. We must have the courage and the will to do it. So I am all for scrapping, at the same time, working towards something different and more honorable to humanity when we talk about poverty and people who are living under poverty.
We hear you. What should a minimum income be for a poor family in New York City or Atlanta, for that matter?
So let me say this to you. 2006, if I can go, I probably could go further back than that. It was said, my boys were babies, right? There was a need to have $53,000 to $55,000 to raise two kids at that time. They were babies. And so are we really talking about what it would take? I think it's a low estimate. I think when we talk about how much it takes to raise a family and just be comfortable. So I would say to you, if you would have asked me back then, I had really no idea of what it would take. It wasn't until I was exposed to the fact of how I was trying to pull up my bootstraps when it would never happen. So I would say to you, push ahead today, 2020, that figure of 53,000, 55,000 is out of the ballpark. It comes nowhere close. So we better figure out some stuff real soon, immediately, with the courage and the will to make the changes that need to be made.
Let me ask you this. I wrote a book on child poverty called Invisible Americans recently, and I did a podcast with the Duke professor, and she said she was surprised I started with food as the highest priority. But among food, health, housing, transportation, and childcare, what do you believe is the highest priority, even for high-income poor people like you were?
Mm-hmm. I'm gonna first go with food. But what I do know is this is what we're always asked, right? We're asked to prioritize what we absolutely need to survive and live a well-being life and to thrive, right? So I'll start with food because, of course, without that, where do you go? But then, what about my housing? Right? Because without housing, where do you have the food? How do you eat? You know, so it's all of those things. I don't think for me today that we can say you need one over the other. We need them all. Anyone on this panel, if we say drop one and not have the other, we would be in a tiff. How could we possibly do that? So think about that for families who are living in poverty. It is the exact same thing. We're still asking folks to do you pay this one or do you do this? Do you do that? I mean, this is ridiculous. And I can really, really say that today because I am new to this. And when I say new to this, 25 years I've been doing this, and to learn that it's been like this since the 1960s, not only with the poverty measures, but plenty other measures, child welfare. I mean, all of it. And then we have, again, the structural racism that plays across the board. I think, if I can say, someone used the term bold. We need to go bold because right now COVID has shown us that we have not been doing service to humanity at all.
Well, thank you, Ann. We're going to continue to get some questions from the audience. I do just want to say with the Trump administration, if it continues, things may well get worse. Some of them want to write the poverty measure down, not up. I mean, fewer people are poor. Some of that administration maintains, I think, based on bad economic analysis. So let's keep that in mind as we go forward. And we don't even know the answer to this, but COVID is driving many more kids into poverty, most likely. So if we could get a good measure of that, it would be great. I'm told to urge people out there to use their Q&A button. While you're doing that, I think Ellie is going to gather some questions. I'd like also quickly, as always, to thank Bernard Schwartz, who supports us financially, no matter what we think. He allows us our predilections, our passions, our anger, and our follies. So thank you, Bernard. Anything going on, Ellie, from the audience?
Yeah, so we've got some really great audience questions coming in. The first one we'll start with is, how do popular tools like the MIT Living Wage Calculator and the United Way ALICE measure compare to the OPM and the SPM? What factors do they consider that are different from the OPM and the SPM? I know Anne mentioned healthcare and childcare, as did Sean, but maybe any other factors that would be considered in that.
So Sean's looked into that. Do you want to take that up, Sean, and respond?
Sure, and
to anybody?
Sure, and I also typed an answer to this in the Q&A just now, but they're much higher is the bottom line. Like more than twice as high. I think one of the questions with those measures is whether those are poverty measures or whether they're measuring something else, higher than poverty. And, I think that's a question that's worth discussing. I mean, there's probably room for having measures that are, have a different label or whatever, and that are even more generous. But the bottom line is they're much higher. They tend to always include childcare and healthcare. They're a little bit harder to operationalize in the way that we do with the SPM or conventional poverty measure.
Ellie, any other audience questions?
Yeah, kind of along those same lines is, what do you think the likelihood of including a savings component or an assets component is in assessing a poverty measure?
So should we include savings? Arlick, should we include a savings allowance in a poverty measure, ultimately, ideally?
It's a different concept. It's hard. It's very hard to operationalize. I also agree that it's important and would tell you a lot more about people who are living on savings, retirees, their circumstances. So I think it's fruitful for future research.
You know, researching the poverty line going back from my own work in my own book, a number of analysts did include savings allowances in their proposed poverty measures or budget proposals for the poor. It was kind of interesting. Anne, do you have a view on savings as part of the poverty measure?
Yeah, I do, and I think it is an important component from someone like myself who also works on assets and wealth building, right? You know, when we think about economic mobility, we do think about the ability to just tuck away a little bit of money to get you through some of those, you know, emergencies that happen to everyone in everyday life, right? When a car breaks down, or you know, when something in the home needs a desperate repair. So, you know, I think it's a signal to us as a nation to say, what does real kind of economic security look like, and what do you need to be able to weather the daily existence where we know that there's ups and downs. So I think it's something that's important that should be looked at.
Sandra, is there any way poor people can actually save?
Well, I will tell you, if everything is put in place, such as looking at childcare, healthcare, food, housing expenses, and some type of supplement given across the board, I believe so. But at this particular stage, absolutely not. Savings cannot be considered a penalty for people who are living in poverty. So if you can save, or if you have any savings, you are deterred from making that known because it's used against you. Poor people are not, in my assessment of it, able to build any type of anything towards wealth, right? And we can't do that because of everything that we're talking about. We can't do that, right? I'll just use myself as an example, and I tell you, lived experience is something. When I look at the fact of the matter is that if I didn't have from 1980 some savings, or you know, just from a previous job of a retirement, where really would I be? Really? I mean, you have a health issue and you're getting a bill for $100,000 with no insurance. How can you pay that? So these are the things that I'm talking about, that we have people who are living under every day, trying to make it, struggling, and they will not make it. And then you talk about a loss of job and a starting over, and you're starting over each time from nothing in the barrel. So for me, when we talk about people who are living in poverty, when we talk about the intersectionality of all the systems, these are drivers. And if we want to stop this, we must be courageous, we must have the will, and we must be bold to do this, because that is what it's going to take.
Interesting. Let me ask Sean, and Arlock says he agrees we should adopt a relative poverty measure. What are the political forces keeping us, Sean, from adopting a relative poverty measure? Because there are lots of opponents. Arlock, you might want to add to this.
Yeah, I actually don't know what, you know, I think there's a lot of people who worry that, who have worried that it's maybe too, I don't know, too close to inequality, doesn't draw a bright enough line between inequality and poverty. But you know, the line isn't that bright, and that's one of the reasons we should do it. I think the other fear is that it automatically gets used then to in programs. And that's where I think too, again, I think we need to draw a sharp distinction between statistical uses of poverty measures and programmatic uses of poverty measures. Just getting, you know, this point of, one of the reasons I think we need to stop using the OPM as a statistical measure is because it's just inaccurate. But that doesn't mean that we can immediately discontinue its use as a programmatic measure. In fact, we'd have to continue its use in the time being. But I think we have to seriously say, you know, the Census Bureau is violating its own statistical principles by continuing to use this as a quote unquote statistical measure that it publishes 100-page reports on and treats like a serious measure.
Arlick, any quick comment on that, or should we go to one more question from the audience?
Yeah, I think we have time just for one more question and maybe use that as a chance to do some final
Yeah,
comments
question
from
is
the
good.
panelists.
Okay. Ellie, do we have one last question from the audience?
Yeah, just 1 second. I'm trying to find, it was the question that what, by international comparison, what does the US, how do they kind of compare how the US measures poverty versus other countries, and a discussion on what all goes into that among different countries.
Would anybody like to put a couple of numbers on that? Arlick, Sean, Anne? Arlick, you have that at the tip of your fingers?
I would just say that Sean is right on the money here. I mean, maybe Sean can add some nuances here, but that lots of countries use 60% of median income standard, very much like what Sean is proposing we start to measure. I think that's all to the good. I may have a slightly different perspective than Sean on whether we should start something that's called an above poverty, that's got a different name than poverty. We have so many things that are called poverty measures now, it starts to get a little confusing. And there's a politics, unfortunately, in this country, deeply enmeshed with our racial politics, where when you use the word poverty, and you can see this in focus groups, when you use the word poverty, people will suddenly shift white people will suddenly shift their attitude and start opposing programs that a minute ago they were supporting. I think if we have a higher than poverty standard, a get along kind of standard that reflects what people actually feel they need to live on, that might help us sort of with that communications challenge in this country.
Low income maybe instead. So we'll call you that your final comment, Arlick, if you don't mind, and we'll go on to Anne and Sandra for final comments and Sean for final comment. We don't have much time. Anne?
Yeah, I would just say that really what's holding us back is deep-seated narratives about deservedness, which has driven the OPM in the first place, and will continue to, as Arlick mentioned, about when you say the word poverty. I think that we do have to think about mechanisms in which there actually is public input onto a measure, where this does become transparent, where we can have conversations about income inequality and income volatility, where we do look at regional differences, when we do look at how families are organized. These are the conversations that need to take place, and where we are with OPM does not help us do that. I would say that, yes, we call some of these things alternatives to poverty measures. I would call them more cost of living indicators, right? To tell people how far away we are from our poverty measure. So there's a lot of work to be done, and we've got to dig in on this narrative, or else no matter what your political affiliation or ideology is, it often comes down to this idea of who's deserving and what they are deserving to get.
Michael Katz, The Deserving Poor. Great book. Sandra, we only have a minute or so left. Can you give us a final thought?
I just want to say that there is much work to be done. All things to this end must work in unison. There isn't one thing that we can work on at one time. I want to say thank you to all of the panelists who've given me the opportunity to bring my voice. Nothing we can do can happen without those affected and the community involved at the onset. And again, just thank you. And Andy, love seeing you. And thanks to everyone. Sean, for your report, and Jeff for your book as well. And I'm going to leave it at there. We must be courageous. We must be willing. And we must be bold, and we must not let up.
Thank you all, panelists. Thank you,
Thank
Anne.
you.
You have to wrap it up. Sean, do you have 5 seconds of something to say?
I can't really say anything better than that, but I just really appreciate this opportunity, and great to know there's so many people out there interested in this.
Let me thank Jeff for moderating this panel. A special thank you to CEPR, to the rest of the Century Foundation staff, and all of our speakers. And I will note that a recording of the event will be made available immediately to our website, immediately following, in addition to Sean's paper, which is on both the CEPR website and the Century Foundation website. Thank you all for being here. Look forward to engaging with you in the future.
Thank you.